We shall never surrender.
One small step for man.
I have a dream.
Did all those famous people really utter those historic quotes, or has someone been playing jiggery-pokery with the evidence? Professor Buzzkill sets the record straight on quote or no quote.
You know, politics in the United States has often been divisive. Just in the few short years that this show has graced the podcast world, we've seen a dramatic increase in violent political language and, of course, with January 6, 2021 and other incidents, actual physical political violence. By the way, there's no causal connection between the start of this podcast back in 2015 and the rise of the vicious politics that we see almost every day now in the USA. Increasingly in the 21st century, there's been talk, and indeed some serious proposals, for certain states or regions to leave the United States and form their own countries. Almost routinely now you see news reports of California threatening to leave the Union. Often this proposal includes Oregon and Washington, and the three would form some sort of Pacific States of America or something like that. Some Texans threatened to revive the old Republic of Texas, which lasted from 1836 to 1846, and go out on their own. And, of course, states from the old Confederacy, with some border states like Kentucky thrown in, make the same threats often. In this specific case, the case of the old Confederacy, some people in the rest of the country, that is the North and the West, say things like, "Sure, leave. Your ideologies and behaviors are so radically different from ours that we'd prefer to have you gone." At times like these, pundits and commentators usually drag out the old U.S. Army General Winfield Scott quote about how the American government should react in 1861 to the seceding Confederate States. On March 3, 1861, General Scott wrote to William Seward, soon to be Lincoln's Secretary of State, advising him to, quote, "say to the seceded states, 'Wayward sisters, depart in peace.'" Now that quote is repeated all the time, especially in documentaries about the coming of the American Civil War. Ken Burns' famous and popular and historically shaky Civil War series from 1990 used the quote to argue that several important Union politicians and high-ranking military officers thought that it wasn't worth trying to hang on to the states that were so fundamentally different from the rest of the country and that were bound to keep rebelling about slavery for decades. Now, I know you think I'm about to say that Winfield Scott never said that. After all, almost all the historical quotes we discuss on this show are bogus, at least in terms of being attributed to certain people incorrectly. But Scott did in fact write this to Seward. But there are major problems with the standard story that goes along with this quote, that Winfield Scott and many others pressed Lincoln and Seward to let the Confederacy go as the best and most realistic policy. That's the complete opposite of what Scott proposed, which I'll explain in a moment. But first, some context. Between Lincoln's election on November 6, 1860, and his inauguration on March 4, 1861, these things happened. South Carolina seceded from the United States on December 17th. 6 more states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, seceded during January 1861. And Jefferson Davis was appointed as provisional president of the Confederate States of America on February 18, 1861. And oh, by the way, if you're keeping score at home, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee seceded between April and June 1861, that is after Lincoln was inaugurated. Now, people in the national government and on Lincoln's transition team, they didn't actually have formal transition teams back then, but you know what I mean. His advisors between the election and the inauguration were passing around all sorts of ideas about how to react to the seceding states. As commanding general of the Army of the United States, Winfield Scott's opinions on what to do mattered greatly. He wrote to William Seward just before the inauguration that, in his opinion, Lincoln had 4 options, none of them good. 1. Keep working on the various compromises that had been rumbling through Congress for the previous 6 months. Maybe an arrangement could be reached. 2. Blockade southern ports. Maybe they'll give in. We'll starve them out. 3. Invade and conquer the South. It would take 3 years, require a massive army, result in many deaths, and leave an embittered southern region to be occupied by government forces for a long time. And number 4, allow the Confederacy, that is the Wayward sisters, to depart in peace. It's very clear from the order in which Scott wrote these options and from his other communications with Lincoln and Seward that letting the Wayward sisters depart in peace was the least preferable option. It would cost fewer lives, sure, but it would also open the door to endless state secessions in subsequent years whenever a state or region disagreed with a certain federal policy. So whenever you hear about Winfield Scott giving the Wayward sisters suggestion to Lincoln, remember it was number 4 on a list of 4, dead last. And that the entire quote in its context shows that the issue was a whole lot more complicated than just letting Wayward sisters depart in peace. How does this help us understand the current spate of threats to leave the Union? Perhaps the best direct answer is that California or the Pacific states breaking off and forming their own country, or Texas becoming its own republic again, would be extremely complicated and expensive, far more complicated and expensive than in 1860, 1861. Think, for instance, of how difficult and lengthy the process was for Britain to break away from the European Union recently, and Brexit was really only about economics and trade. West Coasties or Texicans forming their own country would also require setting up relations with foreign countries, negotiating the transfer of property from the United States government to their new country, creating their own military and getting rid of the U.S. military bases that are currently within their states, and 1,000 other things. The immense complications and expense will probably prevent it from happening. But there is one thing that we can apply from Scott's quotation, it seems to me, and that's the concept of wayward sisters. We have a lot of wayward citizens in our country right now, and despite the most recent election results, the number of wayward citizens may be increasing. The last few years have shown that some Americans, especially some very powerful Americans, have been willing to challenge legitimate election results, attack the U.S. Capitol and try to hijack the peaceful transfer of power, reduce voting rights and voting access, encourage the flood of automatic weapons onto our streets, ban books, demand denominational religious education in public schools, and 100 other wayward things that would skew the long arc of our American experiment in democracy, freedom, and self-government. Recognizing the serious danger presented by these people is the first step in avoiding a civil war. Trying to help them understand that they are trying to halt American progress and talking them out of pushing the United States over a cliff is the next step. Only that way will these wayward citizens become real citizens eventually again. Talk to you next time.